There is a narrative in the Old Testament that, honestly, I find to be the most disturbing in the entire Bible. It may be considered inappropriate for minors, so before continuing with this video, I want to make it clear that it may not be suitable for all ages and may trigger past traumas. The story I mentioned can be found in chapters 19 to 21 of the book of Judges. Many people know chapter 19, but do not continue reading the rest of the story. I believe that there are significant lessons that you and I need to learn from such a disturbing narrative. First, I will tell the story as dramatically as possible, and then we will explore the lessons that I believe we can learn. Join me in chapter 19 of the book of Judges. In chapter 19, verse 1, during a time when there was no king in Israel, a Levite who lived in the remote part of the land of Ephraim acquired a woman from Bethlehem in Judah as his concubine. I want you to understand that here is a Levite man living in the north of Israel, and he acquires this woman to be his concubine, or wife, whichever you prefer to call it, and she lived in the south, in Bethlehem. Let's continue with the story. She was unfaithful to him and left him for her father's house in Bethlehem of Judah, where she stayed for 4 months. She betrayed him and returned to her father's house in Bethlehem. Essentially, the Levite wants to retrieve his wife, so he travels from the north of the land of Ephraim to the south, in Bethlehem, to seek out this woman and be with her again. He arrives there, and her father is very hospitable. Several times the man says, "I must go, give me my wife so that I can return home." And the father says, No, stay one more night. He says, "Okay, I will stay one more night." This repeats for several days, until finally the man says, with all due respect, "I appreciate your hospitality, but I must leave, I need to go home." So finally he sets out for home, and this is where the tragedy occurs. While the man is traveling with his concubine in the south of Israel, from Bethlehem towards the north to Ephraim, they were near Jebus, and the day was almost over. The servant said to his master, "Please, why don't we stop in this city of Jebus and spend the night here?" But his master replied, "We will not stop in a foreign city where there are no Israelites. We will continue on to Gibeah." Then the servant suggested, "Let's try to reach one of those places and spend the night in Gibeah or in Ramah." So they continued their journey, and the sun set as they approached Gibeah in Benjamin. They went there, and to their surprise, no one was willing to receive them in their homes. Hospitality was a significant aspect of Israelite culture. At the end of the night, an old man appeared in the square and asked, "Why are you still here? Has no one taken you into their home?" They replied, "No, no one has taken us in." The old man said, "You can stay with me tonight." The Levite replied, "Great, just so you know, we don't need anything from you. We have enough food for our donkeys, for me and for my concubine. We just need a place to rest our heads. If you give me a pillow, that's all I need." The old man said, "No problem, you can stay with me." So the Levite, his servant, and his concubine spent the night in the house of this man in Gibeah. Then this happened. While they were enjoying themselves, suddenly wicked men from the city surrounded the house and beat on the door. They said to the owner of the house, the old man, "Bring out the man who came to your house so that we can have sex with him." Wow, this is where the story takes a turn. There are wicked men living in Gibeah, Benjaminites, who go to this old man's house and say, "We know you have a guest in your house. Bring him out so that all of us can have sex with him." See what happens next. The owner of the house went out and said, "Please do not commit this wicked act, my brothers. After all, this man has come under my roof. Do not commit this outrageous vileness. Here, let me bring out my virgin daughter and this man's concubine. Abuse them and do whatever you want with them, but do not commit this outrageous thing against this man." We will deal with this a little later in this video, but what happens next is unthinkable. Verse 25 says, "But the man did not listen, so he took his concubine and brought her out to them. They raped and abused her all night long until morning. At dawn they let her go." Now, my friend, this is why I said that this video may be considered inappropriate for minors and may trigger some things from your past, because imagine here, there is a group of perverted men and they are taking turns having sexual relations with this woman. They are raping her all night long until the morning, when they finally let her go. And that is what happens to this young woman, a tragic beginning. In the morning the woman returns, and at dawn she collapses at the door of the house where her master was staying. You can imagine how exhausted, beaten and abused she was from all night by these men, that she barely had the strength to crawl back to the man's house and simply collapsed on the threshold and lay there. Now notice what happens next. It says here that when her master got up in the morning, he opened the doors of the house and went out to continue his journey. There was the woman, his concubine, collapsed near the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. "Get up," he said to her, "let's go." But there was no answer. The woman had been so abused that she had died. Notice that it says here that the man put her on his donkey and went to his house. What happens next is very sad and horrible, but it says the following. When he entered his house, he took a knife, held his concubine, cut her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and then sent these parts throughout the territory of Israel. Everyone who saw this said, "Nothing like this has happened or been seen since the day the Israelites came out of Egypt until now." Think about it, discuss it, and talk about it. This man took his concubine to his house, cut her into 12 pieces, and undoubtedly attached a letter to each piece of his deceased concubine and sent a different piece of her body too. The 12 tribes of Israel, with a letter detailing exactly what had been done by their own brothers, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin. And when these other tribes saw and read what had happened to this woman, they said, "Nothing like this has happened in all our history." Now there is much more to the story in chapters 20 and 21, so I want you to wait. But this is where I want to start looking at some lessons we can learn from this. The first lesson is this. When there is no accountability in our lives, we tend to go off track in a big way. Look at Judges 19:1, which we read earlier, but I will read again. "In those days when there was no king in Israel, you and I, when there is no accountability, when there is no fear of having to explain our actions or be held responsible for our decisions, we are more likely to make bad decisions because we think we can make those decisions in isolation, without having to answer to anyone." And that is exactly what was happening in Israel. There was a law, but people did not respect it. It was not enforced, and as a result, they ended up doing something that they probably never imagined they would do. The second lesson I want to highlight is that we need to make sure we treat all human beings as bearers of the image of God. Here is this man saying it would be wrong for them to do what they wanted with this man, but they can do what they want with my daughter and with this man's concubine. His mentality was that the life and virtue of this man were more valuable than his own daughter and this man's concubine. We need to make sure, and that's why looking at inappropriate sites and such, we need to make sure not to do that. If you want to stop looking at things online that you know you shouldn't be seeing, and you know what I mean, I want you to see every girl you're looking at as a bearer of the image of God, as someone who is your daughter. Imagine if you would want someone looking at your daughter doing the things you're seeing on the screen. But here's the third thing I want to highlight in this video. The further you and I drift away from God, the more vulnerable we become to doing things we never thought we would do. Look, when you look at the book of Judges as a whole, what you'll see is a nation of people who slowly drifted away from God, who slowly went astray, and what you see happening in chapters 19 to 21 is the culmination of drifting away from God and shows how far the nation as a whole has drifted away from God. And my friend, you and I are no different, because if we don't keep a close connection with God, if we drift away from God, if we stray from God, it's then that we, like the Israelites, will find ourselves doing things that someone 10 years ago would have tried to tell us we would do, and we would have been convinced that there was no way we would do those things. There's no way I'll get divorced. There's no way I'll have an affair. There's no way I'll get fired from my job because I was caught watching something online. There's no way I'll be smoking marijuana or whatever it is. The further you drift away from God, the more vulnerable you become to committing that sin. Now, the story doesn't end in chapter 19. I wish it did, but it actually gets worse because what happens now in chapter 20 is a civil war between the 11 tribes of Israel, and they are fighting against the tribe of Benjamin, because it was the tribe of Benjamin that committed that atrocious act of sin against one of their own Israeli brothers. So I encourage you to read in detail chapters 20 and 21. But to summarize, there is a huge battle. Thousands and thousands of lives were lost as a result of this battle on both sides. And what ends up happening is that only 600 Benjaminite men remain. Then in chapter 21, the other 11 tribes begin to feel pity or remorse for the tribe of Benjamin, because they are essentially concerned that this tribe of Benjamin will become extinct, since there are only 600 men left alive, but no Benjaminite women to marry and reproduce with. Now they have another problem, because now they are worried that one of their 12 tribes of Israel will become extinct. This leads to my fourth lesson. Every bad decision we make has consequences that we cannot choose. Although what these Benjaminites did was wrong, the other 11 tribes who came and fought and killed them made a decision that they now have to deal with the result of that decision, and the Benjaminites also have to pay for the result of their bad decision. Listen, you can choose your sin, but you cannot choose your consequences. Each decision you make has consequences, and the problem is that personally, you and I cannot choose those consequences. Then what happens is that the Israelites go and kill men from a clan called Jabesh Gilead, and there are 400 women who have never been with a man. So they take those 400 women and give them to 400 of the 600 Benjaminite men so that those men can reproduce. But what's the problem? Simple math. There were 600 Benjaminite men who couldn't find wives because all the wives had been killed, and 400 of them now have a wife given to them from the clan of Jabesh Gilead. So the problem is that now there are 200 Benjaminite men who don't have wives. And that's why I said that one bad decision leads to another. What happens next is that these Israelites basically say, you know, all of us made a vow saying that we couldn't give our daughters to any of the Benjamites. But it doesn't say anything about if they are taken. So what happens is that they have to make another bad decision and say, you know what? What the Benjamites need to do is send a message and say, look, there's a festival coming up, a party, and basically some of our daughters are going to be dancing and having fun at this party. Technically, we can't give our daughters to you because we made a vow, but if you find them and kidnap them, that's on you. If you find them and kidnap them, we'll be free from this vow, because technically we didn't give our daughters to you. And you can have a wife and reproduce. So they have this party, and essentially these 200 Benjaminite men go and kidnap these women while they are dancing at a party and take them back as their wives. Personally, I know this is a crazy story, and I tried to summarize it as quickly as possible. But the point is this. One bad decision often leads to another, and all kinds of bad decisions affect other people. Go through this story again and see how many people were negatively affected by one bad decision. Some of the Benjaminite men deserved what happened to them, but most of the people in Benjamin had nothing to do with it and died in the battle. The people of Jabesh Gilead died too. The women were then taken from their lands and given to these Benjaminites, and then these other women were kidnapped by the Benjaminite men and taken from their families. All of this happened because of bad decisions. But here is the fifth and final lesson that I want to encourage you with today. God has grace for us, even in the midst of our most destructive decisions. Notice how the book of Judges ends. It says here that the Benjaminites did this and took the number of women they needed from the dancers they captured. They returned to their own inheritance, rebuilt their cities, and lived in them. At that time, each of the Israelites returned from there to his own tribe and family. Each returned from there to his own inheritance. And of course, the last verse of the book of Judges characterizes and describes the entire book of Judges. It says here that in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. My friend, although God was merciful in allowing this tribe of Benjamin to rebuild and not become extinct, there were consequences for their decisions. And if there is nothing else that you take away from this video, I want to encourage you to understand that every decision you and I make has consequences. Often they cannot even be measured, and consequences that we cannot choose. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye for now. God bless you.